The grid is wrong. Why the wealth tax has been right for decades and still hasn't moved. Both sides are running the same con. Not the same argument. The same con. They are selecting the metrics that flatter the conclusion they want and suppressing the ones that complicate it. The wealth tax debate is conducting itself on both sides in this mode. The piece you are listening to refuses to. Here is what is documented. When the Sunday Times Rich List was first published in 1989, 15 British billionaires held about £27 billion between them, roughly 4 pence in every pound of GDP. Today, the Equality Trust calculates 157 British billionaires hold just under £670 billion, more than 22 pence in every pound. The richest 200 families have grown their wealth at 5.2% annually in real terms across that period. UK GDP has grown at roughly 2%. The richest 50 families now hold more wealth than the poorest 34 million Britons combined. That is the moral and arithmetic foundation of the wealth tax argument. The moral force of the argument is overwhelming. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. Here is also what is documented. Britain, according to the Institute of Economic Affairs' May 2026 paper Fool's Gold, already raises 3.7% of GDP from wealth and wealth-related taxes. Inheritance tax, capital gains tax, stamp duty, council tax, property taxes. That is the highest share in the OECD. Spain, which still operates a formal wealth tax, raises 2.2%. Switzerland 2.1%. Norway 1.2%. France introduced a wealth tax in 1982, modified it repeatedly, and abolished what was left in 2018. Sweden tried one and dropped it in 2007. Denmark the same. The Nordic social democracies, exactly the countries the British left routinely names as proof that the model works, have largely concluded that the formal wealth tax does not. You can hold both of those documented sets simultaneously. You should. They do not cancel each other out. The wealth at the top has concentrated at a rate that would have been impossible without active political protection. The mechanisms typically proposed to reverse that concentration have a 30-year track record of being introduced and abandoned by social democratic governments, including the ones that introduced them. Both things are true. Pretending only one is the move I want to refuse. Roman Sciarametta has named this analytical failure precisely. Both sides in a contested debate select the metrics that flatter their narrative and suppress the ones that complicate it. The result is two camps shouting selectively true facts at each other, neither lying in the strict sense, both producing false impressions. The wealth tax debate has been conducting itself in this mode for years. The IAA paper does it from one direction. Gary Stevenson and Gabriel Zucman, in different ways, do it from the other. Selective metrics, deployed strategically, producing impressions neither side could justify if the complete picture were on the table. The piece I want to write is what the complete picture looks like. There is a cooperative team puzzle. 6 counters. A 6x6 grid. The task is to place each counter so no two share a row, a column, or a diagonal. It looks like a logic problem. It is in fact a team dynamics problem. The solution exists, almost always, in the room. Someone has spotted it. Whether the group reaches it depends entirely on whether the social dynamics of the group permit the person who spotted it to be heard. The wealth tax community has the solution-shaped object, not the solution. The solution-shaped object. They have correctly identified the destination. They have correctly identified the moral case. They have correctly identified the data. What they have done is read the grid wrong. The counters are being placed in the right shape on the wrong board. And the people in the room who can see this, Vlad Vexler, for one, are being treated as though they had attacked the cause rather than analysed its method. The grid is wrong in 5 specific ways. Let me walk you through them. The first wrong grid problem is sequencing. The wealth tax is being presented as a first move, a near-term, persuasion-driven, achievable policy outcome. If only enough people were convinced. If only enough Nobel laureates signed the letter. If only Zucman could get 15 more minutes on Newsnight. Look at what the wealth tax actually requires structurally to function. It requires supranational coordination, because concentrated wealth is portable, unlike concentrated workers, unlike concentrated factories, unlike concentrated farmland. The Montreal Protocol analogy fails at exactly this point. Ozone-depleting chemicals could not change jurisdiction. Wealth can. A 21st century wealth holder owns a legal structure that can be restructured faster than the legislation can be drafted. Supranational coordination in any realistic sense means European alignment. not the G20, not the OECD, not a UN agency the United States can veto. The OECD's minimum corporate tax architecture, which Zuckman cites as a model, was real progress. It is already fragile. The second Trump administration is pulling away. European alignment, in turn, means Britain confronting the real costs of re-entry. That conversation is the one the political class has been allergic to naming. That confrontation requires governments capable of multi-decade mandates rather than 4-year oscillations. First past the post does not produce them. Proportional representation does. And proportional representation requires a hung parliament at the next general election, a parliament in which the smaller parties hold the balance of power and make PR the non-negotiable price. That is the chain. Pull any link out and the rest does not follow. The program that presents the wealth tax as the first move has skipped every prior step. It is the destination without the map. It is the conclusion without the working. The second wrong grid problem is the surveillance architecture. To identify who is above a £100 million threshold. Not in the rough HMRC sense in which the state already knows. In the comprehensive, audited, asset-by-asset, jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction, beneficial ownership disclosed sense the policy actually requires. You need the apparatus. The apparatus built for billionaires has not, historically, stayed limited to billionaires. The Know Your Customer infrastructure built for terrorist financing in the early 2000s reached down to the bank accounts of pensioners within a decade. The state asset disclosure machinery in countries with formal wealth taxes touches every household with assets above quite ordinary thresholds. The same political community that correctly identifies state overreach in policing, in immigration enforcement, in welfare conditionality in the Online Safety Act, has not applied the same framework to the surveillance architecture the wealth tax requires. Because the wealth tax is the preferred outcome. Principles deployed as levers, rather than as consistent analytical commitments. I'm not telling you this means the wealth tax is wrong. I'm telling you this means the wealth tax is a much bigger conversation than the program allows. Building the audit apparatus is part of the policy. It cannot be hand-waved away. The third wrong grid problem is that concentrated wealth has options that ordinary savings do not. The wealth tax debate treats concentrated wealth as though it were a coherent target. A Saudi sovereign wealth fund operating through a Luxembourg trust, a Silicon Valley tech billionaire holding company stock, a London hedge fund partner taxed on carried interest, a British passport-holding Thailand resident donor to reform. These are radically different jurisdictional exposures with radically different defensive options. Christopher Harborne, to take the live example, holds British citizenship, lives in Thailand, was listed as a shareholder in the parent company of Tether and Bitfinex, gave £9 million to Reform UK in the third quarter of 2025, the largest political donation ever made by a living person in Britain. He represents, in one biography, the precise problem. Wealth that is British when it wants to influence British politics, not British when it wants to be taxed. The wealth tax assumes a target that holds still, the target does not. Ordinary savings hold still because ordinary savings are stuck inside regulated frameworks that ordinary savers need for protection. Concentrated wealth uses regulated frameworks for convenience, not for protection. When the regulation becomes more costly than the convenience, concentrated wealth exits. It exits to unregulated space, crypto, offshore structures, jurisdiction shopping, private asset classes, without losing the private infrastructure that makes the exit safe. The wealth tax then ends up being a tax on the inability to exit, which means a tax on the people whose wealth is too small or too illiquid to move, the people just above the threshold, whose wealth is anchored in the country itself. As a policy intends, that is what the policy does. The fourth wrong grid problem is harder to name without misnaming it. So I'm going to describe behavior rather than reach for a diagnosis I'm not qualified to make. When Vlad Vexler, a serious analyst, a person who has done more work than most to explain populism to the British left, published an analytical critique of the Gary Stevenson method some weeks ago, parts of the response treated the critique less as analytical disagreement than as an interpersonal attack. What he offered was that the critique amounted to bullying. Vexler had not bullied anyone. He had named what looked to him like an analytical failure mode. This is not a small thing. A community that cannot distinguish analytical challenge from personal attack has confused advocacy with analysis. That confusion is structural, not incidental, and it tells you something about what kind of intellectual work the program is capable of withstanding. A tax policy that needs to be defended like a person is not a tax policy. It is something else. I name this carefully because the people inside this dynamic are not bad people. The instinct to protect the person carrying the argument is the instinct of a community that has been on the losing end of decades of bad faith attack from the right press, and feels, correctly, that it has been treated unfairly. That instinct is not the problem. The problem is what happens when the instinct activates against a serious internal challenge from someone who shares most of the analytical commitments at issue. If the response to Wechsler is the response to internal critique, the program cannot be developed. It can only be defended. Defended programs do not become law. They become identity markers. The fifth wrong grid problem is the one nobody on either side wants to say. Britain is talking about itself as if it were Luxembourg, a small wealthy enclave with sufficient surplus to redistribute its way out of any social problem. The conversation about wealth and the conversation about productivity are running on separate tracks. The wealth conversation is being asked to do the work the productivity conversation refuses. The structural truth is that Britain is no longer a high-income economy in the way it was 20 years ago. It is an upper-middle-income economy, with a high-income London attached. Manufacturing is at 8% of GDP. Public debt is at 94%. Welfare spending now exceeds income tax receipts. Real wages have grown at less than 1% annually for 15 years. There is no fiscal headroom in the system. The wealth that exists at the top is not a redistributive surplus the state has politely declined to claim. It is, in significant part, where Britain's growth has been captured. I am not saying that legitimizes the concentration. It does not. I am saying that a wealth tax conceived as a substitute for the structural economic conversation Britain has not yet had is not a wealth tax. It is a coping mechanism. You cannot redistribute your way out of a productivity problem. You can only build your way out. The wealth tax debate, conducted in the absence of a productivity debate, becomes the means by which a country avoids talking about its actual situation. A short historical detour. Stay with me. In 1909, David Lloyd George brought a budget to the House of Commons that included a small tax on undeveloped land, the People's Budget. The House of Lords, composed disproportionately of Britain's largest landowners, vetoed it. The constitutional crisis that followed produced the Parliament Act of 1911. The formal subordination of the Lords to the Commons. The principle that money bills could not be blocked. The land value tax itself was never introduced. That story is more than a century old. The architecture it describes is older. The pattern of British land ownership goes back to 1066, the Norman Conquest. The redistribution of the country's land to the conquering aristocracy. The systematic disinheriting of the Anglo-Saxon population. The Domesday Book is a tax register. It is also a survey of who had stolen what from whom. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 challenged it. The Diggers of 1681 challenged it. None of them succeeded. The Norman architecture survived every attempt at reform, refining itself with each defeat. The rearguard action is older than the rearguard action. The young person asking why they have to be patient is asking why they are still living, in 2026, inside an architecture imposed by armed invasion in 1066 and refined across nearly 1,000 years of defended position. The impatience is rational. The historical answer is that the architecture has won every previous time. The question is, what would make this time different? The answer, I think, is sequencing. This is the move the wealth tax debate is missing. Reform UK's power is not primarily economic. It looks economic. Taxes, immigration, the cost of living. But the underlying current is recognition. We see you. We know you have been done over. We know your community has been hollowed out. We know nobody in Westminster speaks the way you do. We see you. The programme, such as it is, comes after the recognition. The recognition does most of the work. The progressive tradition consistently offers a programme, better policies, higher taxes on the rich, more investment in services, greener energy. The programme is, by most analytical measures, better than what reform offers. It does not matter. Programme loses to recognition, every time. Electoral reform is not just a fairer system. It is a change in the recognition architecture. Under PR, the Green vote in Brighton is not a wasted moral statement. It is a representative. The Reform vote in a Labour seat is not protest. It is a representative. The system stops telling 40% of the electorate that their preferences do not count because they live in the wrong postcode. Recognition is built into the architecture. A land value tax is not just a more efficient tax. It is a constitutional statement about whose relationship with the land is legitimate. The person who pays rent is recognised as making the place. The person who owns the field they have never visited is asked to justify the rent extraction. Adam Smith argued for it. Milton Friedman argued for it. Henry George wrote a book that sold more than 3 million copies arguing for it. The Greens have argued for it for decades. You cannot run the economics without the politics. You cannot run the politics without the cultural identity. They are the same conversation. The rearguard action has understood this since the Powell Memo of 1971. The progressive tradition consistently refuses to. Here is the constructive turn the piece owes you. The wealth concentration data is correct. The moral case is overwhelming. The destination is right. What follows is the order in which it has to be reached. First move, electoral reform. Tactical voting at the next general election to produce a hung parliament. Smaller parties, Liberal Democrat, Green, SNP, Plaid Cymru, making PR the non-negotiable price of supporting any government. Legislate PR within the first parliamentary session. This is the keystone. Without it, every subsequent move is hostage to whichever party wins 35% next time. Second move. Land value tax. Not a wealth tax. A reform of existing property taxation, council tax, stamp duty, business rates into a single ground rent on land value. No new audit machinery. No new surveillance infrastructure. The thing being taxed cannot leave the jurisdiction. Cross-spectrum theoretical support from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman to the Greens. The first move that addresses the wrong asset problem at the centre of British inequality. Third move. Progressive reform of existing wealth-related taxation. Capital gains tax aligned with income tax. Inheritance tax loopholes, the agricultural relief, the business property relief closed. Carried interest treated as income. Pension tax relief reformed at the top. The technical Richard Murphy programme. Substantial revenue without the surveillance architecture of a formal wealth tax. Britain already raises 3.7% of GDP from wealth-related taxes. Make those existing taxes do the work they were designed to do. Fourth move. Supranational coordination. European alignment on minimum effective tax rates for the very largest holders. This is the multi-decade project. It cannot move ahead of the politics. The politics is set by what Britain does at home in the first three moves. Fifth move. Comprehensive wealth tax, if and when the architecture exists. If and when the coordination exists. If and when the political mandate exists. If and when the country has had the productivity conversation alongside it. Honest timeline. 15 to 20 years. I am telling you that because the alternative is telling you a story I do not believe. And you should not believe either. Anyone offering you the wealth tax in the next parliament is selling you the destination without the map. That is not a lie exactly. It is a con of a particular kind. Real grievances channeled by clever people toward a program whose effects on inspection will not be what the program promises. The grid is wrong. The counters are in the right shape. The board is being misread. The work in the meantime, the work for the next 4 years, the next 8, the next 12, is electoral reform. Land value tax, closing the existing loopholes. Holding the European alignment. Having the productivity conversation Britain has been refusing for 40 years. That work is not glamorous. It does not produce a single morally satisfying Newsnight clip. It is the work that makes the destination reachable. The young person asking why they have to be patient deserves an honest answer. The answer is that the architecture they want to dismantle has survived every previous frontal assault, and the only attacks it has ever lost have been structural ones conducted over generations. The 1832 Reform Act took a generation. The 1911 Parliament Act took 15 years of Constantine 45 settlement took a world war, and 7 years of Labour government with a stable majority. None of them moved fast. All of them moved. Hope, if it comes after the work is done. The solution is in the room. The group is choosing not to use it. Not because the solution is wrong, because the grid has been misread. Read the grid correctly, and the counters place themselves. Sources for this piece include the Equality Trust's May 2026 analysis of the Sunday Times Rich List, the Institute of Economic Affairs Paper Fool's Gold by Christian Niemiec, and Electoral Commission filings for the third quarter of 2025. The argument builds on earlier work on Stay in the Room. Convergent analytical voices include Vlad Vexler, Roman Sheremeta, Gabriel Zuckman, and Richard Murphy. The wealth concentration data is documented fact. The dependency chain analysis is evidentially grounded inference. The 15 to 20 year sequencing prescription is structurally plausible speculation.